Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek Enterprise Season 4. This video I will cover every episode of Season 4 of Star Trek Enterprise. So this is part of my series of videos to cover every episode of Star Trek Enterprise, and in this video I will cover Season 4. So, Season 4. I like to say that there's two kinds of Enterprise watchers in this world. Those who think Season 3 is the best season of Enterprise, and there are those who think Season 4 are the best season of Enterprise. Now, those two opinions are both very valid and acceptable. I suppose, those are the only two groups of Enterprise watchers that matter. Like anyone who thinks that the first two seasons is the best season of Enterprise, first of all, I have a hard time believing these wackos exist, and secondly, if they do, their opinions don't matter. They are, in fact, invalid. Although, I will say, I have seen, as I said online, there's a few Season 3 haters, and even they will admit that Season 4 is the best season. That Season 4 is better than the first two seasons. So I don't know if there is anyone who actually is that crazy to believe that either Season 1 or 2... They're objectively wrong if they exist, so they don't matter. Anyway, there are those who believe that Season 4 is the best season of Enterprise, and I think that's a very valid opinion. I can see that point of view. I personally am in the camp of thinking that Season 3 is the best season of Enterprise. I do really enjoy Season 4 still. I think it is, as I said, is definitely way better than the first two seasons still. But to me, it didn't quite capture that intensity, the drama, the magic that Season 3 had, and that classic Star Trek feeling. But Season 4, basically how I would describe Season 4 is this is what Enterprise should have been from the beginning. When they announced that they were doing a prequel Star Trek series, a prequel to the original series, this is what they should have done. This is what the show always should have been. And Brennan Berga, instead, he didn't want to do, and that was my main complaint about the first two seasons. He didn't want to do a prequel to Star Trek. He wanted to do a right stuff astronaut show, and that did not fit with Star Trek, and that this is not what a Star Trek show should be. And they finally come to realize it, and that's why those first two seasons really didn't work. Here, they said, well, let's show the origins of Starfleet, the origins of the Federation. And this is what you should get. This is the kind of show you should get. Now, it's funny, I'm not the only one who thinks that. Brennan Berga himself has said in interviews, more recent interviews, that Manny Coto should have been the showrunner of the show the entire time. So if you don't know, Manny Coto took over as showrunner in Season 4. Manny Coto first, and I talked about him in my Season 3 review, because he first came on board as a writer halfway through Season 3, and the second half of Season 3 was way better. Shocker. Shocker that. And he became on as an executive producer writer. And also, during Season 3, Brennan Berga and Rick Berman, who were the showrunners for the first two seasons, were slowly being pushed out, and Manny Coto's slowly being pushed in as showrunners. So towards the end of Season 3, which again, end of Season 3 was the better half, end of Season 3 was amazing. Best section of episodes of any Star Trek. I'll put it up there with any Star Trek series, let alone Enterprise. Enterprise is hands down. That's when Manny Coto started taking over. So by the time we get to Season 4, Brennan Berga himself has said in interviews that the studio was pushing, particularly Rick Berman, that they were pushing Rick Berman out because they were very unhappy with what happened with Nemesis. And they were very unhappy with the nosedive of the ratings that Enterprise went through in its first two seasons, and how no one liked the show. So they started pushing him out in Season 3, and by the time we get to Season 4, they basically had shoved him out where his credit was just an honorary one. And same with Brennan Berga. He said that he was really just a money man at this point, that he had no creative input, that it was all Manny Coto. And you can tell the vast improvement. Even you can lump season 3 because, as I said, season 3 is when they started this process of pushing Brennan Berga and Rick Berman out. And you can tell the mass improvement, how instantly, colossally better the show got. So I do, and I talked about Brennan Berga. He's a great writer, and I just recently reviewed Year of Hell, the Voyager episode, which is my favorite Voyager episode. I think it's one of the best episodes of all Star Trek. Brennan Berga wrote that, and he's singly responsible for that. That was his baby. And he has a lot of other really great episodes like Frame of Mind, but I think I was going to say Best of Both Worlds. I think he wrote that with Ronald D. Moore, but at the top of my head, I don't know. But anyway, Brennan Berga has written a lot of my favorite, a lot of awesome episodes of Next Generation and Voyager. So I don't say he's a terrible showrunner, or a terrible writer, sorry, but he is a terrible showrunner. And because he would often do these things towards the end of Voyager where he tried to make it like the 20th century. And he doesn't get Star Trek. And that's another thing. When he was hired as a Next Generation writer, a lot of fans would make fun of and mock him because he never seen a single episode of the original series when he was hired. And for Next Generation, they were actually specifically looking for people. And I talked about this. It's kind of carried on for Voyager, Deep Space Nine, the first few seasons of Enterprise as well, is that they had a ban on hiring anyone who was a Star Trek fan. They specifically wanted people who knew nothing about the franchise, which I question that policy. Next Generation, I can kind of understand that because they didn't want it to be a mimic of the original series. They want to set itself apart. They want to do its own thing, and I think they were very successful at that. So I don't think there was anything wrong with Brennan Berga not really knowing anything about Star Trek when he was writing Next Generation or even Voyager. But wanting to do a prequel series that takes place before the original series, that is a huge issue. That's a huge problem. And that's why it didn't really feel like it belonged in the Star Trek universe the first 2 seasons when he was in charge. Because he doesn't understand Star Trek. He's not really familiar with it. I'm sure by this stage he went back and watched some of the original series, but still, he was not a fan. He didn't really know the kind of vibe, the kind of show. And I think that's totally the inappropriate person to be doing a prequel. Now, Manny Coto, as Brennan Berga has said himself several times, was a huge Star Trek fan. So obviously when they hired him, they started relaxing their policy on not hiring Star Trek fans. And just saying that he had lived and breathed Star Trek. And it really, really shows in season 4 once he fully took over as showrunner. Because this is really I like to call this the fanboy season. But you shouldn't get that confused with fan fiction, because this is definitely professional writing. This is the writing in this season is definitely at a professional level, much better than the first 2 seasons, I would argue. So it's not that Manny Coto is just some layman fanboy. No, he's obviously a skilled writer as well as being a fan, and that's exactly the type of person that you want in charge of a show like this. And it really, really shows. And as of several episodes, in fact, that happen in the season, you can tell are really fanboying out. And you can also really tell that Rick Berman had been pushed out by the stage, because Rick Berman would never allow episodes like this in earlier seasons. I've heard so many stories about so many good ideas in Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager being quashed by him being no, because he's too rigid and doesn't want anything too fanboyish or whatever. Where in this season you can really tell that he wasn't able to do that anymore, that they had essentially pushed him out, because you get episodes like In the Mirror Darkly, which would never happen when he was around. Never. And Rick Berman, again, he helped make Next Generation what it was, but by the time we got into Voyager era, like late Voyager, late Deep Space Nine, beginning Enterprise era, he was actively destroying the Star Trek franchise. A lot of people say, oh, people just had franchise fatigue. No, people had Rick Berman fatigue, because he was really destroying the Star Trek franchise. He was holding good writers back from doing good jobs and actively pushing scripts that made no sense. And he wrote the fucking Voyager finale, but on the game. But anyway, so getting rid of him was the best idea that they had. And so this season was really great. It was also really original in the fact that, unlike season 3, which told one serialized story, but they didn't want to go back to doing episodic the way the first 2 seasons were, so they did something really unique in the Star Trek franchise. Is that the season is mostly made up of 2-parters and 3-parters. There's a couple of standalone episodes. And there's a couple of standalone episodes that aren't really standalone. They actually depend on what happened before and after. But mostly you have 2-parters, you have 3-parters, and a couple standalones. From what I've heard, Doctor Who's kind of like this, although I've never watched Doctor Who, so I wouldn't know. But yeah, that's pretty unique within Star Trek. And I think I don't know, I think I personally would prefer the season 3 format of entire serialized story arc. But this was interesting as well. This also was better than just doing standalone episodic stuff, because it did also allow for character development. And there were some storylines that were ongoing throughout the entire season, and not just within these 3-parters and 2-parters. But as you know, Enterprise was canceled after season 4, which was a shame, because this is when the show really, I would say season 3, I still love season 3 better, so I would say season 3 is the best. So season 3 is when the show got good. But season 4 is when Enterprise became the show it should have always been. It was a prequel. Now, part of the reason why I like season 3 better is because it kind of defied its premise, and I love that, because I don't like this premise. But if you gotta do the premise, this is how you do it. Season 4 is how you do it. And so, and Manny Coto was in charge. They pushed out Rick Berman, and Brennan Berga was just a money man, didn't really have any creative decision. So, and you ended up getting a mostly spectacular season. So it's a shame that they got to this amazing point, and this is when they decided to cancel the show. It was more done for political reasons. And it was a miracle in itself from everyone I know who worked on the show that season 4 happened in the first place, because they were really looking at canceling it after season 3, because unfortunately they were still looking at the numbers from the first 2 seasons, and even though the ratings did improve in season 3 and 4, there were still, I'm sure, a lot of people who never returned to the show because they were so off-put by the first 2 seasons, which is fair. But had the show kept going, and had it improved, and it would have improved, because Manny Coto was now in charge, they would have regained viewers. And so this is more, and this is what I tell a lot of people, Enterprise's cancellation, from what I've read, was more of a political decision by UPN, because UPN was, when they first launched the show, Star Trek was their biggest property. But they were now wanting to go in a younger, fresh direction. They wanted to attract younger viewers. All their other shows, they had like the WWF and a lot of like sitcoms aimed at younger viewers. So they were wanting to attract that like WB audience. And so Enterprise didn't fit into that theme. So they got rid of it, because it wasn't the direction, and it wasn't like it was the ratings behemoth that they needed to keep, unfortunately, because the first 2 seasons saw a massive drop-off of viewership that most of them never came back. And that's why Enterprise was canceled, unfortunately. It wasn't because people had franchise fatigue or any bullshit like that. It's because UPN wanted to going in a new direction. And it's interesting to note, as I said, it wanted to be WB like. Well, eventually they ended up merging the two networks into the CW. So that's the eventual, and Star Trek doesn't really fit into that. And plus, I think this is around the time that CBS, that the Viacom split happened, and CBS was acquiring the rights to Star Trek, and that complicated matters as well. So, political reasons is why Enterprise got canceled, unfortunately. And it's really unfortunate that because so many people were talking about, ironically, Sci-Fi Channel picking up the show. Because it's hard to think about nowadays, because nowadays Sci-Fi Channel is where good shows go to die, and they cancel everything that's good. But back in the day, Sci-Fi Channel was actually picking up canceled shows like Stargate, SG-1. I think there was a couple others that got canceled by other networks that, Sliders, that Sci-Fi Channel was picking up. So people wanted them to pick up Enterprise, but unfortunately they did not. And I think because in order for them to pick it up, the parent company would have to agree, and I think CBS was just wanting to kill Star Trek at this stage, which is unfortunate because now they're at the stage where CBS wants to revive Star Trek, because they now, like, having franchise properties is all the trend and is seen as something to be taken advantage of. So, maybe if that was the feeling back then, Enterprise would have lived, but whatever. It is a shame that it got canceled just when it's gotten good. And at the moment, I say Enterprise is one of my least favorite Star Trek shows, and that's because half of the show sucked, because half of the show was season 1 and 2. But if the show kept going, and I always have to admit this, if it went the full 7 seasons that the other Star Trek shows did, then it would likely have 5 amazing seasons and 2 bad ones. Gee, what other show does that remind me of? Next Generation. So, I think to an extent, Enterprise is always held back by its premise. I talked about this before. I would never say it's as good as Next Generation or Deep Space Nine, because its premise and cast of characters were inherently less interesting. But this season in particular kept really making efforts to make these characters and this premise interesting. They were doing a way better job with this blank cast of characters and premise than the first 2 seasons did. And here's another thing. I don't think Brennan Berga is racist. But a common complaint of the first 2 seasons is that all the minority characters were shoved to the side and not given any personality or anything to do, and they're focused mainly on the white characters. I don't think that was intentional. I think that was more of Brennan Berga so idolizes this 50s era of astronauts, and that's what he was trying to recreate. And you can tell, I talked about this in my review of the first 2 seasons, a lot of episodes had a Leave It to Beaver feel to it. He was trying to emulate 50s TV, and so he was emulating a time that was white dominated and mostly racist, and minorities just shoved to the side. So that's what it ended up. I don't think that was intentional on his part. I think that he was just trying to emulate the 50s too much. And you can tell that they try to change this, because in this season, Merriweather's given a lot more to do. They're trying to elevate his character. Same with Hoshi. She's given a lot more to do. They try to give her character more personality and make her more than just a seamlessly background character. And they bring it, they had a really interesting, strong female captain is introduced, Hernandez, in this season. And so they're trying to... Yeah, I know I'm a damn SJW, and if you don't like that, please leave my channel right now. The SJW is a bullshit term anyway. But anyway, this is what Star Trek should always be like. And that was part of my complaint. And I think when I did my review for Enterprise as a whole, I said that it was boring that they just had another stereotypical white hero captain and some fuckhead commented on my channel saying that I was being racist towards white people. That guy can fuck the fuck off. That it's just the stupidest thing ever. First of all, not being racist towards white people, which is white people never catch a break, do they? Especially in the 50s and 60s. They were so discriminated against. No. It's not that. I only bring up the color of the skin is because it was typical of having a cliche normal character. It's like I could even say like if it was a blonde hair or something. You want to have a character, a stereotyped character is like, I'm the white hero here to save the day, and every single character is like that. When I was growing up as a teenager, I used to think that Star Trek should have more female captains, more women captains. It's not, and it's because mainly. It's not because I was an SJW or any other bullshit people would say, but it's because it's more interesting. Then it's different kind of storytelling. It will shake things up rather than just having the same bland thing every time. And that's what I thought Archer was. That he was a bland remake of Kirk. He was just your stereotypical starship captain without any color or personality. And this season, to its credit, again, this is another thing. Well, season 3, I think, actually did a much better job of this. Of changing that. Of making it different. So he actually did have personality. And he wasn't just your bland, stereotypical starship captain. Also, by the way, he was no longer incompetent. Like he was in the first 2 seasons. So this felt more like Star Trek. Anyway, this is enough of the preamble. Not quite enough. Actually, I want to talk about season 5. Because, what are you talking about? There's no season 5. But they had plans for season 5. And most of those plans sound amazing and make me really upset that season 5 never got made. Because I heard that they were going to do like a prequel to Cloud Miners, which is one of my favorite original series episodes, and show like Stratos beforehand. That sounded pretty awesome. And they were going to do like other things that would build off of like original series concepts. I can't remember off the top of my head, but they all sounded amazing. And it's really... Oh, they were going to explore the Romulan War more. They were going to show the Romulan War, which is something you can see them setting up for in this season. And that's something any like Star Trek prequel should have, because it was been established in Star Trek lore that there was this Romulan war against like Starfleet, against Earth, before even the Federation formed. So they started to preamble that this season. So I would have loved to see them get into that more, and it's a shame they never did. But there was one idea that they were planning on doing, which I'm actually glad they didn't do. And that is they were planning on having Alice Krug, who played the Borg Queen in First Contact, bringing her in to play a Starfleet engineer and to show the origins of the Borg Queen. That sounds so horrible to me. I hate the Borg Queen and anything to do with it. I think they should just leave it alone. So I'm actually kind of glad. And that is the only thing that makes me glad that Season 5 didn't happen, because that would have been terrible. I mean, especially because Enterprise did such a good job with regeneration. And it's so good because it's standalone, because they knew to leave the Borg alone, unlike Voyager, who didn't know this. And so why ruin that? And so they would make the same mistake Voyager did. Let's ruin the Borg by bringing in the Borg fucking Queen. Oh, God. So I'm glad that sounds so dumb. So anyway, let's get into the episode, starting with Stormfront. This two-parter was okay. It was kind of... Season 3 left them with the cliffhanger. I think it was Brennan Berga's idea. Because he's obsessed with having like stuff taking place during World War II and having the Nazis as villains. Like, this episode reminded me too much of The Killing Game, which I also did. I really did not like The Killing Game from Voyager. It's the episode where the Hirogen took over the ship, and for some reason they went to the holodeck and were recreating World War II, so where the crew had to live out World War II in the resistance, and where aliens were dressed in Nazi uniforms working alongside Nazis. It's a very similar concept here, although I would say it's better because it's not the holodeck, it's actually like an alternate reality. It's an alternate history, which is a bit more interesting to me, and plus they tied it into the greater temporal Cold War storyline. But this is a remnant of Brennan Berga era because he's obsessed. He's basically recreating Killing Game because he's obsessed with the 40s and 50s, so he has to do World War II all the time. And so that aspect of it I didn't really care for. But I think Manny Cotta did the best that he could with this premise. And that's another great thing about Manny Cotta is because he took in he came in and he made Enterprise the show it always should have been. Should have been more of a prequel to Star Trek. But at the same time, he didn't disregard the first 3 seasons. He was still very respectful and tried to tie everything up that the first 3 seasons did. So he took in, where Brennan Berga left him off, and they could have just found a way to undo that in 5 minutes. Be like, oh no, actually, here let's just Archer shoots the alien. They go back to the 22nd century and everything's perfect. But no, he played this out, and I think he did a fairly good job. And at the same time, he tried to tie up the temporal Cold War storyline. They basically solved the temporal Cold War because it turned into a hot war, which caused all these fractures in history, which is interesting. I think that's a very interesting concept. Now, I also, in my season 3 review, I talked about how a lot of people hated that cliffhanger. I didn't mind it so much because I had already seen this 2-parter. And what the 2-parter actually does with the cliffhanger is actually kind of interesting. I don't think they had that in mind. I just think that, let's just have Nazis and aliens and Nazis because Brennan Berga is unimaginative. He's not very creative. Again, he's a great writer, don't get me wrong, but not a good showrunner. But anyway, so they did something interesting with that. So I didn't mind the cliffhanger so much because I already knew that they would do something interesting with it, and they would find a way to actually tie it into the greater themes of the temporal Cold War, and it was actually kind of interesting seeing Archer running around in an alternate New York that had been taken over by the Nazis and working with your typical New Yorker loan shark types. That is Sal. That was pretty cool. I gotta say, the character that he met, I can't even remember her name now because she was so throwaway. I often get her confused with I don't know. There's other throwaway characters that they meet in the past and become an ally and doesn't really count to much. So that wasn't. It was very reminiscent of Lily, actually, from First Contact, especially the way Archer took her on the ship and was showing her space, and it's like, oh, it's space, but whatever. So these episodes were fine. I mean, the thing with Nas, it was kind of a throwaway villain. The way he talked was a bit off-putting. He was like, I am going to conquer the world, and you Nazis should not threaten me. And as I said, the whole thing was a bit too Killing Game reminiscent. It reminded me way too much of the the Hirogen working with Nazis. Now we have these weird aliens working with Nazis. But I still like inclusion to it, and I like that he ended up having to work with Archer. And I like the fact that they killed him off, and that they were like, okay, let's wrap up this whole temporal. They basically solved the temporal Cold War because it turned into a hot war, and Archer defeated the main faction that was causing all the issues. But I don't know. I think that, although I do give Manny Cotta credit for not just sweeping the whole temporal Cold War under the rug and actually addressing it, I do think that we should have got a longer resolution to this. I think that they should have did this throughout season 4 and not just wrapped it up in this 2-parter. And we never learned who Future Guy was, which is a huge issue. Now, I think part of the reason might be because apparently Brennan Berga had the idea that Future Guy would be Archer. And I think Manny Coto came on and rightfully saw that was a stupid idea and so decided to sweep the whole Future Guy thing under the rug. That's just my speculation. But, I would love to get a reveal on who Future Guy was, but not if it was Archer. If that was the way they were going to go, then it's probably better that they just not reveal who it is at all. I think it should have been a Romulan. That's what I've been saying since the very first season, and I think that would have went along with the theme of preambling the Romulan War that they were doing in season 4. So I think Manny Coto should have just revealed it to be a Romulan. It's my thoughts. I don't know. Anyway. So these episodes were, it wasn't the best way to wrap up the Temple Cold War, but it was decent. It will suffice, shall we say. So these episodes were decent as well. Anyway, let me get into the next episode, which is Home. Oh, also another thing I should make clear, I didn't make clear at the start, is how the season is broken up into 2-parters and 3-parters mostly. And I made the executive decision that for my videos, and it's my video, so I make this decision, that for 2-parters I will lump them together and review them as one episode. But for 3-parters, I'm going to split them up and review each episode individually. Which I know is a bit confusing, but I decided 2-parters, it's basically just one story stretched over 2 episodes, whereas 3-parters, it seems more like Game of Thrones Breaking Bad territory, where those episodes I could review individually, because those episodes each have their own flavor within a larger story. And I think the 3-parters more fit in that thing, where the 2-parters not so much. The 2-parters basically is just one story stretched over 2 episodes, whereas when you start to stretch it over 3 episodes, it gets a bit thin, and each episode has its own individual theme. So that's just what I decided, and that's going to carry on to my countdown, which will make that confusing as well, because the 3-parters will all be broken up into their individual episodes, but the 2-parters will be lumped together as one. That's just what I decided. That's me, my executive decision, my video, so that's what I do. Anyway, sorry. Had to get that out of the way. Anyway, next episode is Home, which I recently, just a month ago, did a review for, so it seems like I'll be repeating myself. And I'm going to be doing one for Stormfront in a month as well, so I have to repeat myself there. But anyway, I love Home. I think this is a great episode. I think I said this very controversial statement before on my channel. I think this is better than Next Generation episode Family. I think the episode's a bit overrated. I mean, it's a good idea to deal with the aftermath of the Borg incident, and I do like how the episode handles that, but for the most part, it's kind of like the whole thing with his brother being a dick to him. I didn't care about that. It's kind of annoying. We're here. I think this is a much better way to wrap up the Xindi storyline. It deals with the change in Archer's characters, how he's basically suffering from PTSD, which makes a fuck ton of sense after the traumatic incidents that was shown in season 3. And this is what I love. I love, because other than the example I gave with Family, for the most part, when Star Trek has these traumatic, huge incidents happen, they just, like Chain of Command, for example, where Picard was tortured, they're just never referenced again. Ever. And they have no impact on the characters. And I love how they take the time out to show the impact of, because Archer did some really fucked up things, and also Earth almost got destroyed, and this is something that they will touch on throughout the entire season, which I love. It's great continuity. It makes a lot of sense that the Xindi incident would have, and is a huge thing. It wouldn't just be swept under the rug. It would have a huge impact on society as a whole and on the individual characters. And here we deal more with how it affected Archer, who's suffering nightmares where he sees the Zindi show up and throw him off the cliff, and how he thinks that he hates the people idolizing him, calling him a hero, because he knows of all the shady shit he's done. He knows that he basically pirated and stole from another innocent alien species, and that he had a pirate tortured, and all this other shit that he had to do in order to save humanity. And the fact that a quarter of his crew died on this trip is definitely, you can see how that's weighing so heavily on his conscience, and that he doesn't really think that he deserved to live. He definitely doesn't think he's not really suicidal in this episode, but he definitely hates being seen as a hero. And I love that. And I love, as I said, I love the introduction of Captain Hernandez, I think, and she's a great sort of foil for Archer, and she's a good captain in her own rights. I think this character really enhances the Star Trek universe, and I love their interactions. Now, and I also like what they did with Phlox, having to deal with xenophobic humans, which again, as I said, makes a lot of sense, showing the aftermath that this Xindi conflict would have on Earth, and so Mayweather and Reed almost got into a bar fight over it. Like, that was all interesting stuff as well. Now, Trip and T'Pol stuff, I think, was the down point of this episode. I don't like Trip and T'Pol, and I would say they're the down point of the entire season, actually, because I'm not a huge fan of their relationship. But again, this is a thing that they built up in season 3. Instead of trying to just sweep it under the rug, they do address it this season. Although I will note that it was ended by the end of this season, so if Enterprise would have went on to a 5th season, then it would have been no more, which was a smart thing to do. So I like how they ended it gradually, and this was a very powerful episode of a story of Trip having to watch the woman he loves marry another man, which your heart aches for him, and I think they did a good job relating this. So even though I hate the Trip and T'Pol romance, I did think this was handled pretty well in this episode. So overall, I thought this was a great episode. I absolutely loved it. Anyway, we'll now get into the next episode. We'll get into the Augments 3-parter, and I'll talk about the first episode in that little run, which is Borderlands. So this episode, so the whole Augment 3-parter, I did a whole review on this already. It's an interesting concept, and again, this is, you can show Manny Cota's love for Star Trek shining through as he's bringing up the genetically engineered, like, supermen of the eugenics war, and touching on that. And so it's really interesting to see that is in the Enterprise's past and how that affects the future. Although the thing with Dr. Soon being, like, you know, the ancestor of Nudine Soon who created Data, is just, that was kind of a cheap way to get Brent Spiner on board. But Brent Spiner is a great actor, so I do like seeing him, and I think he does such a great job in this role as well. But it was so cheesy. I guess this is the 3rd episode I'm jumping to, but it was so cheesy at the end. It was like, oh, cybernetics, that's where the future lies. I'm like, it's dumb. But I did like, other than that, I liked his inclusion here. This episode mostly dealt with them searching for the Augments and Soon constantly trying to escape, and then using, like, they introduced the Orion Syndicate as slave owners. Now, I talked about the Orion Syndicate before, how this episode in particular plays off the Orion Syndicate as they are, like, basically the official government body or military arm of the Orions, whereas in Deep Space Nine they're portrayed as more of a organized crime organization that are comprised of aliens from many different species, not just Orions. Now, and my headcanon for justifying that is to say that during this time period, which maybe even was what the writers were thinking of, but during this time period, the Orions were strictly an Orion organization that was mostly running their official Orion government. But eventually, I think that the Orion democracy took over and piracy became was no longer the official sanctioned stance of the Orion Society, and therefore the Orion Syndicate, instead of just disappearing, it went underground, became an organized crime unit, and started to encompass other alien races in order to thrive, because it was no longer the official standing for the whole race, or the official government sanctioned organization. Now it was an underground, so it needed fresh new members of other aliens in order to thrive. And it did thrive to become a very powerful, the most powerful organized crime organization in the Alpha Quadrant. But I totally made all that up. I don't know if there's any beta canon, but beta canon doesn't count. But because they would just be making that up too. But to me, that would fit. So for that, I'm willing to forgive the fact that this doesn't seem to match up to how the Orion Syndicate is presented in Deep Space Nine, because if you have that little headcanon explanation, it actually makes a lot of sense, even though I just made it all up. But the episode itself, where several crew members get captured and are sold into slavery, it was pretty intense. I like how they just had some random ensign show up, and T'Pol had to kind of soothe his nerves. I like that. I like the use of not everyone has to be a main character, and they can just throw in some random ensign, and he's kind of naive, and T'Pol had to try to protect him. So that was good, and I also liked how Soon kept trying to escape, and Archer gets the better of him. But of course, at the end, Soon finally does manage to escape. So it's a decent episode. I will say that. So next episode in the trilogy is Cold Station 12. I like this episode more. I thought this was a lot more intense. This is mainly dealt with Soon taking over this space station controlled by humans and Denobulans that had all of the augment fetuses or embryos that he wanted to capture, so he could, raise a whole society of augments, which, as we see, is a bad idea. And it did deal a lot with how you can see it was more interesting, because in this episode you saw Soon and Malik work together, and at first everyone's like, all the augments are treating Soon like their father, saying call him father, but you see the divide start to form, because he's not genetically enhanced, and so they start to view him as an outsider, or some of them do, particularly Malik, because he's very ambitious, and that's kind of the whole point of the augments. This whole point of this three-parter is that superior abilities breed superior ambitions, and I think Archer even quotes that from a scientist who created the augments. And that's really the whole point of it. And so you see that Malik, his ambitions outgrowing, and he doesn't. So Soon is interfering with his morals, not wanting to kill people and whatever. And there's that conflict that rises within them. And Soon, and for his part, is in denial about this, because he wants to believe that his children, the augments, are the future and that they are great. So he's purposely blinding himself to the very obvious flaws that particularly Malik is displaying. And I like that. And I thought this particular story around was super intense, that they took the hostages on Cold Station 12, and that they started like torturing and killing them to try to get information, to get the codes so they could get the embryos. And then Archer and his team comes on board to try to stop them, but they're easily caught. I love that. I love that the fact that they present these augments as being Superman, as being superior, enhanced. And I love how they don't skimp on that. They make that true. They show that Archer, like in that first episode, the Malik is like, I'm going to attack you, and then he kicks Archer's ass, even though he warned him. And here, like, the augments are smart enough to detect them immediately and trap them, and they stay true to the fact that they're superior, which makes it more interesting. So I like to end this episode itself is very intense with, having torturing Dr. Lucas and then killing one of his colleagues. Now again, this is when we first get introduced to Dr. Lucas, when we first see him, because we're introduced to him in the first 2 seasons as the person who was writing letters to Phlox. And I think we got a voiceover from him before, which is very clearly played by a different actor, but I'm okay with this. But, and I talked about this in my full-length review, I think this character was a bit miscast, because the actor they had to play him was a bit too... I just see him... It's the jump to conclusions guy from Office Space. I kept saying him... kept wanting him... kept expecting him to say to Malik, he was like, oh, you think I have the codes? You're jumping to conclusions. See? And I can't take him serious. He's too much of a comedic actor to me to take serious. And this is such a serious episode, a serious, intense role where I think... they should have gotten a different actor. Nothing against this guy's acting abilities. He's a great actor, but I just couldn't take him serious in this role. But other than that, I thought this was a super intense episode. So anyway, getting to the next episode, which is the Augments. This episode I also thought was decent. I don't think it was quite as good as the previous one, but it was still a good episode that concluded the arc of the Augments. It had the conclusion of Soon being outs by Malik when Malik finally realized that he doesn't need Soon, and of course this upsets his lady friend, who I can't recall her name off the top of my head, but she sides with Soon, and he ends up killing her. I don't know, there's something about that seemed a bit cheesy to me. I'm not sure if I can't really put my finger on it, but it seemed, I don't know, it seemed a bit cliche in some ways. But anyway, it was still a very intense episode because Malik wanted to start a war with the Klingons and the Federation that would devastate the Federation. So they were trying to release all these viruses on the Klingon colony to kill everyone and frame Starfleet from doing it to get the Klingons to attack him. And so Archer had tried desperately to stop them. And so it was a really good, interesting cat and mouse thing. And eventually Enterprise picked up Soon, and Soon joined Archer on his side, and of course Archer had a hard time trusting him, which made a lot of sense after everything he did, but Soon finally came to realize that the Augments were out of control and needed to be stopped, and eventually they were able to do that. So I didn't think this was the best thing ever, but it was interesting. So overall, this Vulcan Trilogy I thought was it was good, but it wasn't great or anything. So anyway, let me get into the next episode, which we'll cover the Vulcan Trilogy. Now, this trilogy I did in fact think was great, and I did absolutely love that. I think it's some of the best episodes of the entire show. So we start with the Forge, which is a really interesting way to start. I love how it starts with this cold open of this ancient history of Vulcan, and we don't really know what's going on, and then they come back and we go to the future or the present times where the Vulcan embassy is bombed, and Admiral Forrest is killed, which really surprised me. I don't know if this is because the actor didn't want to do the show anymore, because if you don't know, the actor who played Admiral Forrest had set the record for making the most appearances in Star Trek. He's played Klingons, Cardassians, Romulans. He's been in so many different episodes of Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, until he finally, and even he played a couple of Klingons in Enterprise too. But then he finally had this recurring role of Admiral Forrest. And I actually came really close to meeting the actor in real life, but I missed him by a day. But anyway, that's another story. So I don't know why they would kill Admiral Forrest. I don't know if maybe Manny thought they wanted to move beyond Admiral Forrest and have something new dynamic, or if the actor wanted to leave. I'm not sure, but maybe they just thought it would be a very strong motivator for this 3-parter, and it was. To be fair, it was a very strong motivator that Admiral Forrest died, and And this is when they really started to change Saval as well. Where, I mean, they started in the episode Home where Saval shook Archer's hand, which I loved. But I love, and this is the three-parter that really started to change him, where Saval was really starting to show. I like the line in particular where he's talking to Trip, and he's like, and he says, I actually learned an affinity to humans, living among humans for so long. I've learned to appreciate them. And Trip's like, well, you hit it very well. And he's like, thank you. Like, that's a nice callback to how Spock would always say thank you whenever someone said you're not human or you're hiding your emotions or something. And so that was kind of a fun little callback. And here's the thing, because this whole three-parter starts to change the way the Vulcans behave in Enterprise, because that was a huge complaint I had in the first two seasons, and a lot of people had about the first two seasons, that the Vulcans seemed out of character. They were being like dickheads, they were being assholes, and this three-parter really, it actively changes that. And so by the end of it, there's like, we've gotten rid of the high command, so now we're going to leave humans alone. So basically we're not dickheads anymore, and we're having these reforms where we're going to be more like the Vulcans you know in the future, in the original series, Next Generation. And I've seen some people use this as an excuse to excuse the first two seasons, being like, oh, it's okay that the Vulcans were dickheads in the first two seasons because they're setting it up a story arc where there's eventually this revolution that happens in this three-parter here that changes and makes it so they're more like the Vulcans we know. No. It doesn't excuse shit. What this is, and there's no way, like in those first two seasons, that they were planning this. They weren't planning this. They're just using it as cheap story device because they wanted to have antagonists. What it actually is, the better way to describe this, is Manny Koto coming in and saying, the Vulcans are dickheads. I don't want them to be dickheads. Nobody likes it. It doesn't make sense. Doesn't fit into Star Trek. So how can I change it? So basically this is a retcon. And usually I use the term retcon in a negative way, but in this term it will be very positive because it's fixing a mistake that should have never been made in the first place. So this is basically correcting a mistake. It does not at all excuse the first two seasons. They definitely, no fucking way were they planning this all along. This is just new showrunners who actually understand Star Trek correcting the mistakes from previous showrunners who didn't understand Star Trek. That's all it is. Anyway, back to the episode, The Forge. Like this, yeah, this episode is a good setup. It's mainly just setup. It has to do with Archer like desperately wanting to investigate this bombing where he lost his good friend, so he goes through the Vulcan Forge, and it has a lot of nice callback to canon. And I just love how season 4 in particular is exploring these worlds of these well-known established aliens. And there's been a few episodes, of course, in Star Trek canon where we have explored Vulcan, the planet of Vulcan and Vulcan culture. But I think this episode, or this three-parter in particular, does the best job of doing that. And of course you get callbacks like Sell It, which again is not a fucking teddy bear. There's no way, even if it was a domesticated version, there's no way this could be called a teddy bear. So it makes no sense why Amanda Grayson refers to it as a teddy bear in Journey to Babel. I'm sorry, it doesn't. But it does match up with the original, with the animated series. Actually had an episode that showed the Sarlacc attacking, or it had Spock had it as a pet or whatever. But it was interesting to see that. And of course we're introduced to the Contra, where they meet Siren in the desert and he dies, but he's carrying the Contra of Surak, so he transfers that to Archer. And there's a very strong fantasy feel to this three-parter, mainly because of that. But again, it's taking established like lore in this is what season 4 is so awesome, and incorporates it into the story. Like the whole thing with Contra was just invented in Star Trek 3 as an excuse to bring Spock back to life, but it's canon now, so they find a way to use that in an interesting way. And of course, Surak has been established since I think the original series, the Savage Curtain. What a horrible episode! But has like sort of the father of Vulcan logic, and so they find a way to sort of bring this together in the storyline that I think is absolutely quite amazing. And Surak himself says he wants to stay in Archer because Archer is a human and the Vulcans have lost their way, and so he wants an outsider who hasn't been corrupted by the current culture. So anyway, since I'm kind of talking about it, let me get into the next episode with this, which is Awakenings, which does deal a lot more with the Contra being an Archer, and how at first Archer just wants it out of his head, which makes sense because he's freaked out by this. And T'Pol is very confused. You have T'Pol and T'Pol. It's T'Pol. T'Pol was a character who appeared as an old woman in Amok Time, and I am never very clear on. I think this is supposed to be the same character, because by the end of the 3-parter, she becomes basically the head of Vulcan society. I think they mentioned in later episodes that she's running the government basically now. And in Amok Time, she was seen as this revered Vulcan figure. So I do, even though I don't think I was ever able to confirm this, but I think this is the same characters. This is supposed to be the younger version of the old woman we see in Amok Time, which is interesting. But anyway, T'Pol is still confusing. But T'Pol desperately wants to get the Contra out and put it into a Vulcan because it shouldn't be in the stupid human. And it does show that she's not perfect. She is very prejudiced against humans. And I love how T'Pol's mother points that out and saying you're letting your prejudice towards humans blind you, but Archer goes along with it, even though T'Pol is very resistant to it and tells Archer not to agree. But T'Pol's you can't refuse, we're gonna fucking do it by force. But Archer's nah, it doesn't matter, you don't have to do it by force, I'll do it willingly. But it doesn't work, as I said, because Surak wants to stay in Archer. And I love how this, it brings a really fantastical element, which I like it. If you can blend fantasy and sci-fi together in convincing ways, which I think this counts, I think I love it. I think it really works because it brings Archer has this knowledge of Vulcan society. He knows where to find, and he wants to find this artifact. And again, this is also very fantasy-like, where there's this magical artifact that can bring peace to the world. Although I don't think the artifact itself has any magical properties. I think it's just a revered artifact that has a lot of writing and information on it. It's like the Forgotten Bible or something. So it's what's written on it, and it shows the true intentions of Surak. And of course, you also have a lot of commentary on how modern day religions that won't go named Christianity, excuse me, that seem to have completely gone away from its original teachings and the original Messiah, whose name they still use, yet they don't seem to go along with, for the most part, its teachings of loving thy neighbor and charity, when it becomes all about electing people like Trump and hating homosexuals. I don't know. But, Mark, you're getting political again. No, this episode is political, because this is definitely an analogy that this episode is making here, that the Vulcans and dominant culture have really gone astray, and Surak himself says that they're not following his teachings anymore. And you have a little side segment of people who are following his teachings, but they're seen as outcasts. And the Vulcan head, what's his name? I don't know. The dude who's also the Admiral Layton from Deep Space Nine. He plays the Vulcan prime minister. That's not his name. I can't remember his high counselor, whatever his name is. Phlox? No, not Phlox. God damn it. Velox? Oh, fuck. I have to look this shit up now. Hold on. Administrator Veloz. That's so Veloz. Yeah. So he basically, yeah, he's the asshole who wants to kill all the Sirenites because basically he knows that they're peace loving and he doesn't want people, the Vulcans, to love peace. And then of course you have the whole storyline with Trip. I like the relationship they build with Trip and Saval. I am starting to warm up to Trip in season 4 a lot more. I think they handle this character a lot better than the first 2 seasons too. That's for sure. And I like seeing how he's willing to like put Enterprise at risk to save Archer, but then of course Veloz eventually wants to get rid of them because he desperately wants to bomb the Sirenites, and it ends up that T'Pol's mother is killed in the attack, which of course very tragic, and most people are either killed or shattered to the wind, where it's just T'Pol, and Archer with the Kirshar trying to get it to the high command so they can reveal to everyone that there's the Kirshar. So amazing episode. Absolutely love it. So now let me get into the last episode of the 3-parter, Kirshar, which I absolutely love. This is an amazing episode, which is about Archer. Again, he's in like full fantasy Messiah mode, where he's able to, like, he does the Vulcan neck pinch a lot and stuff like that because he has the thing of Sorok, the Contra. I love that storyline, and of course the whole thing is about them desperately trying to get the Kirshar to high command. Now you had this throughout this 3-parter. You see Veloz had this other dude. See if I can look up his name. Who was like his second in command. He was another like Minister Kavak. That's his name. He was actually played by a guy who played the villain in season 1 episode. I've seen him in a couple of movies. Anyway, he's usually a bad guy, so it's weird seeing him as a sort of a good guy here, where he was like the whole time you could tell he was like, when Veloz kept wanting to do violence, he was like, what, you're crazy, oh, why are you doing this? And it's like, why does Veloz even have this guy around? But I think he doesn't have a choice. But eventually, of course, he does just have guards pull guns on him and saying, like, stay out of this. But the Kavak was actually the more reasonable guy. So anyway, we learned this episode that the whole thing was a ruse because Veloz wanted to start a war with Andorians. So it surprises me that a lot of people don't catch this analogy, because to me this is a very, very obvious analogy, because this episode came out in 2005. So, what Veloz, he wants to start a war against the Andorians because he claims that they have weapons of mass destruction, when really we learned they don't have weapons of mass destruction. But he's just using that as an excuse to gain more power because he's been corrupted by outside forces, in this case the Romulans, who are promising more power / money, more prestige, if he starts this war that's more beneficial, that would be beneficial to them. So he uses the excuse of there being weapons of mass destruction when there aren't really. Come on. I can't believe a lot of people don't make this connection. And this is part of the reason why I love this episode so much, because I think that was such a bold statement. Like in 2005, the Iraq War was still seen as very popular. A lot of Americans supported it. In fact, I think this kind of died down in 2005, but around 2003, 2004, people were actively being attacked for not supporting the war. On TV, not like physically attacked, but like politically attacked. Like I remember seeing this talk show bullshit where they had this lady on who was very against the Iraq War, and they were just like all making fun of her and shaming her, and oh, how dare you, blah blah, you're so un-American. And so nowadays, so it's of course looked at as by any reasonable person, as a huge mistake. in history, and that, of course, Bush was lying about there being weapons of mass destruction. That was just an excuse to go in and earn more profit. And I love how this episode makes such a blatant statement about this. Back in 2005, when it was seen as un-American to do so. So this really makes me love this episode all the more. But you don't even need that to like this episode, because the episode in itself is such a great story, because while you have Archer having to try to get this magical artifact, well, it's not magical, but get this artifact to save the Vulcans, at the same time you have Trip out with trying to gain the Andorians alliance, trying to warn them, and you have Shran. Shran's such an amazing character, and it was so great to see him again. I love his inclusion. I love how he abducts and tortures Saval, and the scenes were so good because it's so within Shran's character to be so distrusting, and he tortures him, and Saval the whole time is like, "You're going to be responsible for the destruction of your species. Your name will mean fool," and that was just so amazing. And then Shran, because he's such a smart guy, is eventually convinced by this, and so they do team up, and you have this massive confrontation between the Andorians and Vulcans. The Enterprise tries to get right in the middle, but then of course you have Archer come in with the Kirshara, and the Kavak is eventually convinced by this, and he is able to overthrow Velas and save the day. And then they get so now they have the new Kirshara, so it completely changes Vulcan culture, and they dissolve the High Command, has to say, so that this is the Enterprise's fix for the Vulcans are no longer dickheads, and the PAL basically becomes a person of power. And then Archer gets Sirach's Contra taken out of his head, now that it's all over. It was such a super intense episode, as I said, with a great character interactions, great action. I love the build-up. It's a very well constructed plot, and on top of that, it has amazing, bold social commentary to make at the same time. So this is the best of Star Trek. This is what Star Trek does best. This is an example of Star Trek at its best. This episode, absolutely top-notch, amazing. Anyway, let me get into the next episode, which is Daedalus, which is kind of the opposite. We go from one extreme to another, where this episode is really boring. Don't really know what they were thinking. They wanted to introduce the father of Transporter, because Archer's father was obviously the father of warp drive. Well, Zephyr and Conqueror created it, but Archer's father helped refine it and make it more feasible. And so they have this guy who made transporter technology more feasible. Yet at the start of the show, nobody wanted to use transporter technology. Oh, they're so afraid. So it seems to go against this episode. And it was boring. I didn't really care about the characters. They all came off as cliche. And the whole situation, there being a monster in the ship to killing people, and you find out it's really the dude's son who's trapped in the thing. First of all, it felt a little bit reminiscent of that episode Jetrel, where Jetrel came over on the ship it's a Voyager episode. He came on Voyager for false pretenses because he wanted to save someone, but it turned out to be a lie, that he's just trying to bring these people back to life using transporter technology. Pretty much what happens here is that the dude comes on over false pretenses on running tests on transporter, but really he wants to try to save his own son using transporter technology. And it was really uninspired and boring, and by the end of the episode, when they end up bringing the son back, but he dies immediately. It's kind of sad, but I can't say I cared very much. I'm sorry. So a boring episode. Definitely down down point of season 4. Anyway, let's get into the next episode, which is the Observer Effect. I have also already done a full-length review for this episode. I thought it was an amazing episode. I like it so much, I think, because it's so unique. I mean, there's rarely any Enterprise episode like it. And it pulls off this very dark, foreboding tone so well, but it does so by reintroducing a species that's been introduced in the original series, the Organians, but it shows them in a totally different light, where they have this sort of prime directive type thing, where they're not able to interfere, but they just study alien species as they go and get infected by this deadly virus and die, and they just study how they treat it. And I think by having them inhabit Mayweather and Reed, even though it doesn't explore their characters very much, at least gives the actors something to do, because usually these actors don't have much to do. And I do like how they were and they did such a good job. So they are actually really good actors, they're just underutilized. And it was so good seeing that play out. And it's interesting, and especially like it was such a powerful episode to see Hoshi and Trip suffering from this virus. Again, does a lot more to explore Hoshi's character, that's for sure, and her interaction with Trip, and how eventually Archer puts his own life at risk to try to save them, but he ends up failing. They end up dying anyway. Like, that was so tragic. It was so powerful. But then you have Archer finally meets the Organians, and he gives the classic, like, Kirk, like, Star Trek speech. It's like, where he shames the aliens into doing the right thing. It's like, you're not as compassionate as us humans. How dare you? You should be more compassionate. And it's a big cliche, but it's very Star Trek-like. And I love it. And so they managed so the Organians do interfere, and they, of course, were building toward this throughout the episode with the Mayweather. Organian was definitely very much against this and sort of like questioning, and then towards the end he finally overrides the other Organian and is like, look, we got to do the right thing here. And it also sets up to why the Organians would have their own planet of that appears to be primitive, that appears later in the original series. So this is perfect setup. This is a great episode. And I do love the fact that at the end of the episode, none of the main characters remember the Organians because they erased it from their memories, which again sets up for the original series because they didn't know who the Organians were then. It's amazing. Amazing episode. Anyway, we'll get into the next episode. We get another 3-parter. We'll start with Babel 1, which shameless callback to Journey to Babel. They're going to Babel and they have televised Andorians. Because Journey to Babel, if you don't remember, is the original series episode where they first introduced televised Andorians, and they are arguing on the ship, and they have a conflict with each other, so they bring that up in here. But this is more of they bring them to a conference, but then Shran's ship gets attacked and destroyed, and he thinks it's a Telluride, so they're at odds with each other. But we see, in fact, that the ship is Romulan in origin, and the Romulans created this ship using hello technology to disguise itself as other ships in order to start a war, which is very Romulan-like. And we have the dude who plays the Romulan admiral is a guy I like to call Discount Arnold Schwarzenegger because he seems very much like Arnold Schwarzenegger. In fact, he did have a brief appearance in the Terminator, and he was like one of the main villains, like the alien type shapeshifter from the X-Files, who kept recurring, and he also appeared in earlier Star Trek episodes. He played Clag in the Next Generation, which is a Klingon in the Next Generation episode, Matter of Honor, who like befriended Riker. And he also played that red-faced Dosai from the Deep Space Nine episode where Quark goes to the Gamma Quadrant to negotiate, and they're like, we're very serious about profits. Anyway, he actually did a really good job as a Romulan here. As a despicable Romulan, and this was a very intense setup. Like, it did have high stakes, and that nobody knew that the ship was a Romulan origin, and that it was creating conflicts, and having Archer having to combat that was very powerful. And then, of course, Trip and Reed eventually get kidnapped, not kidnapped, but trapped on the ship, and they can't return. And now I'll get into the next episode, which deals with that more, which is United, where they're trapped on the ship and they can't. They're trying to get out, and the Romulans actively trying to kill them while they're trying to sabotage the ship. Like, that was an awesome version of Cat and Mouse. But then you have on Enterprise, of course, you had a misunderstanding between the Andorians and Tellarites that resulted in Shran's wife getting killed. I don't know if they were married at the time, but I know they were mates or whatever. But she gets killed, and so he gets on the revenge kick. Even though, like, they realize now that there's a third party setting them up, and they're not enemies, and they need to work together to take this third party down. They still, Shran still demands revenge on the Tellarite that killed his wife. But then Archer doesn't want this to happen because he realizes no matter who wins, the other side's going to drop out and the alliance will end. So he fights Shran himself, and he finds a way to satisfy the honor by cutting off his antenna. that was pretty cool. And of course, the resolution when they all work together to finally defeat the Romulan ship, that was amazing as well. So this is also a really good episode. So now let me get into the next episode, which is the Aeronar, which is technically it's the third part, but you could also see it as an appendix, as sort of the aftermath. That really Babylon 1 and United were a two-parter, and this was kind of the follow-up to that. But I didn't like this one as much. But I will say, by memory, I actually thought this episode was not good at all. I remember it being extremely boring. But watching it again, I realized I was being unfair to it. That it's actually much better than I remember it being. I think maybe it's because they presented it as if it was the third part. And it really did not hold up to the kind of excitement and intrigue and a really adventure level that the first two episodes had. And it was a lot more low-key, low-key character-based episode. And so once I start to engage, I get rid of my expectations of this high-adventure episodes, and I engage on that level. It actually is a really strong character story about this, the Aeronar. Again, this is Enterprise exploring alien worlds, more like established alien worlds, not just some one-off that we never see again. But the Andorians, like we hear about Andoria, we actually go there, we see that that's all we hear about. It's all covered in ice, and there's a subspecies that have telepathic abilities, and they live in extremely cold areas, and we get like lots of like details that flesh out the world building, like these hot worms that like keep the area like heated, but they're like can kill you if you encounter them because they're so hot. Stuff like details like that is like really amazing, and really just the kind of world building that Star Trek should always be doing. This is something that Manicotti completely understands. So anyway, and then you learn about this young girl, I can't remember her name, but her brother is the one who was kidnapped by the Romulans and being used to kill people, and so she goes on this quest to connect with them. And that was actually a very touching story, and how she eventually does. It results in his death, but at least she stops him from killing all the people and being used by the Romulans, and it was very tragic. And the friendship that she forms with Shran is quite touching, how he's there for her after to deal with this tragic event. That was really good. But the rest of the plot about them trying to find the Romulans, or the Romulans trying to destroy Enterprise, it did seem a lot lesser than the previous episode. So I will say this episode was not as good as the previous two. I wouldn't say it's a great episode, but once I deal with it on the character interactions were good enough to make this an overall decent episode, an overall good episode. So anyway, we get into the next episode, two-parter, which I'll do once, Affliction and Divergent. a divergence. This episode was decent. It dealt with Phlox getting abducted by the Klingons, and the Klingons using him to try to stop a virus, and because they were trying to do their own augments, and it would just fuck things up. And it was really interesting having the interplay with internal Klingon politics and how Phlox is constantly threatened, and how Klingon doctors would work. And then you also get a side plot with Reed. Apparently they was involved in Section 31, so this is when Enterprise brings Section 31 into it, which is also very interesting, because I think this is the first time outside of Deep Space Nine Section 31 was mentioned. And of course it would become to be an established Star Trek staple. Was mentioned in Into Darkness after this, and then of course Discovery later on, and now they're talking about having their own Section 31 show. And so, but it doesn't make sense that the dude it was wearing the leather outfit that said they wanted to be consistent with Deep Space Nine. Those leather outfits are silly, I'm sorry. But again, it helps flesh out Reed's character, that he has this in his background, and something that, and it created this conflict between him and Archer had to throw him in the brig before betraying him, and he had to realize where his alliances were. It was a good character story for Reed. And so the two-parter was very interesting, but I hate the fact, I really hate the fact that they tried to come up with an excuse to why the Klingons look like humans in the original series. It's a makeup excuse. I hate in-universe excuses to try to explain away stuff that's simply just technology changes, simply just makeup changes. It has to do with the time period it's made. Something that's made in the 60s is not going to look the same as something made in the 90s as something made in 2015. It's just not. And you should just write it off. And this is something that pissed me off about Discovery. Whenever they tried to make up excuses for it, it pissed me off. This, I think, is the ultimate worst excuse. Because in Trials and Tribulations, they had to deal with that because Worf traveled back into a time where they saw the Klingons in the original series. And they just read it off as a joke, as we do not discuss it with outsiders. That's the way you handle it, personally. It's just by deflecting, because it kind of is a meta way of acknowledging it's just a makeup change, get over it. But here they tried to make up an excuse that it's because the Klingons were experimenting with augment DNA that's what caused the Klingons to look more human-like in stature. But there's several issues. This explanation actually does not work on several different levels. First of all, it didn't affect every single Klingon. It affected a small amount. So why is it in Enterprise times Next Generation time, every single Klingon looks the way Klingons do with bumps in their heads, but in the original series, every single Klingon looks the way as humans? It doesn't match up. Also, there are certain Klingons that appeared in the original series that appeared later in Deep Space Nine, such as Kor, King, and Koloth, and they all look like humans in the original series, and then they all look like bumps in their head Klingons in Deep Space Nine. So how all of a sudden they were reformed? I guess they tried to pass it off as, because Phlox, that doctor was working with Phlox, says he's going to get into cranial resurgery, so you could make the excuse that Kor and King had their appearance altered to look more like traditional Klingons. But if all Klingons look like humans, then why, which obviously, I don't know, it's just a whole rabbit hole that's just you shouldn't even get into. This is stupid. Just say it's a makeup. I hate the fact that they try to, and so many so many hardcore canon trekkers try to bring this up as a good example of coming up. No, it's not. Just say it's a makeup change and move on. That really pisses me off. Oh, and then you got the whole storyline with Trip leaving, going to the Columbia. And I kind of like that, because I like Captain Hernandez, and I like seeing her more and her interactions with Trip. And you also had Trip's assistant engineer that he talked to the most was played by Seth MacFarlane. So it was kind of interesting seeing Captain Macer from the Orville working as Trip's assistant engineer. That was kind of cool. Of course, I had known that Seth MacFarlane appeared on Enterprise before, but I thought it was just as a background character. I didn't know that he actually had a bunch of lines. But because I didn't remember this episode very clearly, because I wasn't that aware. I knew of Seth MacFarlane when this episode first came out. I knew it was the Family Guy creator, but that's all I knew. I hadn't actually seen him before. So it was interesting seeing him in a new context now that I do know who he is. But anyway, the storyline was kind of interesting, but it seemed kind of pointless because Trip leaves because he doesn't want to be around T'Pol, and then by the end of the episode, he's back on Enterprise again. I don't know. So this episode, this two-parter was good. It was decent, but nothing spectacular. So let me get into the next episode, which is Bound. This episode was quite terrible, if I'm going to be honest here. So they encounter the Orions, and they send the Orion slave girls on the ship, and Archer wants to make it clear that they're not slaves, but then they start manipulating all the men through these pheromones, and then you find out the big reveal that the Orion men are really the slaves and not the women. Now, I've heard some commentary on this episode saying that this was the Star Trek's way, Enterprise way of trying to reboot and retcon, saying because it's actually quite misogynistic and to have the species that keeps women as slaves. So they try to reboot it saying oh no, it's not the women that are slaves, it's the men that are slaves, so that way, so that's okay then. Which, I just hated that reveal. I thought it was a stupid reveal. I don't think it worked to fix anything. I just think it just made things worse. I think actually the whole issue about Orion slaves, I think was actually handled a lot better in a non-canon series called Star Trek Continues. And maybe one of these days I'll cover Star Trek Continues on my channel. But that episode that dealt with Orion slaves, I thought was amazing. This was horrible. This it's just and then they tricked Archer, but Trip was also immune because of his telepathic connection with T'Pol, which is a bit silly, but all the other men started acting oh, I'm gonna beat you up, and it was just so cheesy, and they were being manipulated, but the women were just having headaches. It also reminds me a bit of that animated series episode called the Lori Signal, where a bunch of women infected the men to make them all la la la, like Scotty was singing a song on the bridge, and only the women had their faculties, so the women had to take over the ship. I was expecting something like that to happen here, but it didn't happen. They didn't seem to, even after they knew all the men were infected, they still let them go back into command positions. I think they said the women were infected, but it made them have headaches and made them feel less docile, and that because the pheromones would try to eliminate any competition, but still, how does it react to people who are pansexual or homosexual? I don't know. This episode sucks. I'm sorry, but it does. Let me get into the next episode, which is Inamere Darkly. Now, I should say that by default, this is the best episode of Enterprise, because this is the only episode of Enterprise to not feature that stupid-ass fucking theme song when I'll have to sit through, it's been a long time, therefore it automatically is the best episode of it. No, well, I'm not going to say that, but it is a damn good. This is, in my mind, as I said, I'm convinced this episode never would have happened if Rick Berman was still in charge. This is a full-on fanboying out. We're fanboyish out. Let's just go full-on mirror universe. And I love it. I love it. It's so unique. It's something that Star Trek never... if they did it too much, it would get old. That I will say, but just doing it once is something that the studios, the heads of Star Trek, would never let other shows do. I mean, you could argue Trials and Tribulations did it a little bit. It was a little bit about fanboying out, but this is like full. And I love how they just went full on, like set the whole thing in the Mirror Universe, not even try to say, oh, have our Prime Universe characters in the Mirror Universe. And part of the reason why they did this is because they wanted to respect canon, because the Mirror was the first interaction, although that was destroyed in Discovery, which changed canon then to say there was interactions between the Mirror Universe before Mirror, but oh well. It tried. At least it would have been a lot worse to say there was more interactions between them in all the way in Archer's time. And apparently, like a writer, Mike Sussman, who's also kind of a fanboy, he's been a writer since season 2, I believe, was always obsessed with what happened to the starship Defiant in the episode Tholian Web. Because, well, it gets confused with the Defiant from Deep Space Nine, but it's a different one. Anyway, the Deep Space Nine Defiant should have been called, like, Defiant D or something. It should have been a continuation, because there was already a ship. But anyway, I'm getting off track. In the Tholian Web, there was a ship called Defiant that sort of disappeared, and we don't know where it went, so this writer was obsessed with finding out where it went. So finally, he came up with the idea that went into the Mirror Universe, and that they could have their Prime Universe connection to the Mirror Universe without actually having to have any of our own characters meet. And this, the way it began with the First Contact callback and then having like the people just kill the Vulcans and storm their ship, that was amazing. And also how it bled into the intro, where the intro was all about, it showed like weapons of war. It was like it was a play on that stupid "it's been a long time" intro that showed like exploration. Instead it showed weapons of war, and they played like the evil music. Dun, dun. Like, that gives me goosebumps every time I see it. That was so amazing. That was such an awesome idea. It's so unique and something that Star Trek has never done before, to just fully jump and delve into this universe. And they're just basically, the way the Enterprise is a prequel to Star Trek, this is a prequel to the Mirror Universe. It's explaining how the Terran universe became the way it did. And And of course, they also have familiar aliens that we couldn't see in the Prime timeline because they hadn't been. They established that the First Contact was made during Kirk's time, so they couldn't show them during Archer's time. But here's the Mirror Universe, so we can see them. So we see the Tholians. I mean, the Tholians did appear in season 2 of Enterprise, but it was just their ships. It wasn't their actual seeing them. And so we see them for the first time using like the CGI, and they look like crystalline, and they explain that they need extreme heat to live. Which just makes me wonder how Tholian Ambassador can be on Deep Space Nine, because they mentioned before there's a Tholian Ambassador on Deep Space Nine. Maybe he had like an environmental suit. But anyway, that was really awesome. And of course, in part 2, they show the Gorn, which I will say looks a lot better than the college mascot costume in the original series. But the CGI is a bit outdated. It's early 2000s CGI. It doesn't look very... It looks like he's fighting a cartoon or at least a video game character. But so I'd be more interested in seeing the Gorn with modern technology. I think they could finally do them justice, but it did at least look a lot better than the cheesy college mascot costume. I will say that. And of course, yeah, and that the Saval mirror had to have a goatee. Like, they were so fanboying the fuck out in this two-parter. It was amazing. I absolutely loved it. Now, I don't think these episodes are perfect, though. Like, I think the storyline with Forrest being the captain, like, I didn't really get that. I thought that was kind of dumb, and Archer having to do the mutiny back and forth, and DePaul was against him. Like, I think that muddled the story a bit. Because eventually the story became about how there was a rebellion of other alien species that were fighting against the Mirror universe, and eventually that rebellion was overthrown. And Discovery actually took that and they played with that more, but to an extent that actually wasn't true because to Star Trek, because there were no Vulcans in the Terran Empire, which there should be, because it's established in this episode and the original series that there was just a side group of rebellions. Apparently the rebellion was defeated a century ago, but apparently it resurged a century later for Discovery times. But see, Discovery, when they used the Mirror Universe, they were specifically using it as an analogy for Brexit and Trumpism and stuff, which I still feel is totally, that's what Star Trek does. It's so in keeping with Star Trek. It's incredibly in keeping with Star Trek to make social commentary on the time it is. But this episode, of course, was about a decade before, so it wasn't directly related to Trumpism, but it was still an issue of xenophobia that was rising in America and other countries. And you can definitely see analogies of that and how Archer and everyone talk about how these alien races are impure and they're lesser and they need to be controlled by the humans. It's very, and also, they're gonna come live with us and dilute us, and it's very reminiscent of that kind of xenophobic fear, which actually the next two-parter gets into as well. But yeah, as I said, and it got a bit silly towards the end when Hoshi killed Archer, and it was I'm Empress Hoshi, and I'm that's just a bit silly, I'm sorry to say. And I'm still a bit disappointed that they didn't reference Empress Hoshi in Discovery. I was hoping they would. But Discovery did reference this episode directly, which I actually thought was pretty awesome. Because when Discovery went to the Mirror Universe, they found out that there was traces of the Prime Universe and the Defiant, that somehow, because the Defiant, of course, would have been a classic ship, that's how the Empire stayed alive and was forged. And so the whole thing was about them trying to find information about the Defiant to try to find a way back to the Prime timeline, but that actually turned out to be a red herring. And if you remember this episode, and if you remember Tholian Web, that you would know that it was impossible, because the Defiant, when it came into the universe, it killed everyone on board, the space thing. So there's no way they could use that same method to get back to the Prime timeline, which is something that Lorca knew, but he was just using it as a ruse in order to get them to get to go to this mission. But whatever, I'm getting into Discovery. But I do love how Discovery directly referenced this episode. I thought that was great. But anyway, it was a bit cheesy, over the top, especially Scott Bakula's acting. It was the bridge is yours, Captain. It was a bit, but it was fun. It was a fun episode. So I wouldn't say it was the greatest episode ever, but it was definitely very unique and a huge blast. So anyway, let me get to the next two-parter, which is Demons and Terra Prime. This is another episode which I thought less of before I rewatched it. I thought I would rank this episode quite low because for the most part, I did find it a bit boring. I mean, I did like the commentary it was making on xenophobia, and I talked about before how it's so natural after the Xindi attack that there would be a rise in xenophobia, and here you get the organized humans first, which is obviously a analogy for white supremacists and people who are afraid of immigration because they want to kick all the aliens off their planet because they're making their own pure. They want to make the human race pure. And thinks the concept of humans and Vulcans breeding together is disgusting and despicable and will lead to the extinction of the human race. And you hear a lot of white people say that, white supremacists, about how mixing African American and white blood will lead to the extinction of the white race, which doesn't. And it reminded me of this in season 2 where they met this dude from the future. That when they analyzed his, there was a corpse, but when they analyzed his DNA, they found out he was made up of many different species, and like Vulcans. He was mostly human, but he had Vulcan blood and all these other, and that's eventually what the future will become. And there's nothing wrong with that. And it sort of reminded me of that. Um, I don't know, but the whole like through plot of them like going to Mars and threatening to like destroy Starfleet Command, and I didn't really care for that. But they introduced like another side plot with, as I said, this season's trying to flesh out Merryweather more, so they try to flesh him out. They give him a love interest, a backstory of this reporter that he was in love with. So that I like that. That was interesting. But then they didn't actually do anything with it, that she ended up being a red herring because they thought she was a spy, but she wasn't really the spy. It was this other dude. But that seemed kind of irrelevant, didn't really have anything to do with the main plot at all. So it all felt like kind of unnecessary. I mean, I suppose it would have made sense if it was setting her up to be a recurring character in the next season, but since there was no next season, her inclusion here seems kind of pointless. So overall, I mean, the whole thing about Trip and T'Pol having a daughter, it was just genetically grown in the lab using their DNA, and that really made me lose any connection to it. But I did feel for like T'Pol and Trip, how they were sad, they were crying when their child died. Like that did make a lot of sense and was a bit powerful. So I had to raise the quality of the episode, my rating of it, a bit higher for that, because I think that did actually was very effective. But for the most part, like that RoboCop, who would later go on to be a villain Into Darkness as well. Peter Weller, I think his name is. He's the dude who played RoboCop originally. But he, I mean, he's a good actor, but I just didn't like the character in this. He was a bit, I mean, it was kind of made sense, but it's kind of like seemed out of nowhere. I just don't think these episodes were really well developed. The plot was kind of all over the place. So they were just okay. Alright, so finally let me get into the finale, last episode of Enterprise, which is These Are the Voyages. A lot of people hate this episode at this convention in Las Vegas, everyone voted on the best and worst episodes. This made the top 10 worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. And Brennan Berga has since come out and apologized for this episode, saying it was a mistake. He should fucking apologize for that theme song. Not this episode. He should apologize for the whole first 2 seasons of Enterprise. Not this, but anyway. Anyway, this episode is very well hated. A lot of people hate this episode. And I disagree. I disagree so strongly that I think I would really be willing to fight anyone on this. Now, I don't think this is a great episode. Don't get me wrong. It's mediocre at best. At best, mediocre. It's kind of leaning more towards the poor side. But is it one of the worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise? No. Not even close. Nowhere near close. And is it even the worst finale of Star Trek, of the Star Trek franchise? No way. Objectively, no. Objectively, and I even said this in my review of Voyager, the finale Endgame, that Endgame, the finale of Voyager, makes this episode look like a masterpiece. This episode's a masterpiece compared to Endgame. Endgame is by far the worst finale of not just in Star Trek, of all of television, or at least one of the worst finales. It was such a massive disaster. I think it's really trying to find the right adjective. I would say insulting to even suggest that this episode is anywhere near as bad as Endgame, because it's not. And most people, I've gotten lots of comments saying, oh my god, the Enterprise episode is a billion times worse than Endgame. And I think you are objectively wrong if you think that. I'm sorry. I will fight you to the death on this one. This episode isn't anywhere near as bad as fucking Endgame, the Voyager finale. I feel like I need to specify the finale since the Avengers Endgame came out, and that was actually awesome. So it's hard for me to reconcile it. But no, the Voyager Endgame was terrible. I mean, people bitch about the Riker and Troy involvement in this episode, but the Riker and Troy involvement wasn't anywhere near as bad as fucking 7 of 9 Chakotay romance. I take Riker and Troy narrating the final episode of Voyager. I'd rather they do that and have a fucking Chakotay 7 of 9 romance. Jesus Christ. It's just insulting. It's just objectively wrong to say that this episode is anywhere near as bad as Endgame. But anyway, sorry. You're wrong! You're wrong! Anyway. Sorry. So this episode is fine, actually. I mean, I could see it's not a good episode. It does have faults. Particularly, like, the story, jumping, they do the time jump. I think it's 6 years or something, because they say it's 10 years since they started their mission, I believe. So, doing the time jump is a bit alienating, and none of the characters seem to have changed that much during this time jump. And then having Riker and Troy narrate the last episode of Enterprise does seem a bit like, it seems more like a Next Generation episode than an Enterprise one. And also, through that narration, like them trying to say it takes place during the episode Pegasus, like, I don't buy that. That seems like like it really doesn't fit. So yeah, it doesn't actually make sense in the context of the Pegasus that Riker would have time to go on the holodeck and hang out with Archer and run this program when that was like a high, like really high stakes, high tension episode. And it seems like, I mean, they might have had some breaks in between how long it took Enterprise to get there, because, you know, episodes itself tend to just jump cut straight to the action, but still, I find it hard to, and especially how, like, in good humor they were and how relaxed they were. Like, this is a much more high tense situation. It feels like they're really shoehorning this storyline into the Pegasus, which I don't think it actually fits at all. And, you know, on top of that, they get the storyline about Shran having a daughter that seemed to come out of nowhere, and they have these villains that they're like stereotypical, I'm the bad guy, cliche, and you're not really involved with the storyline at all. And then Trip dies because of this, and they deflate the fact that, because Troy even says, oh, Trip's gonna die, which deflates the fact, so then they toy with you where Trip almost falls off the ceiling. You think, oh, is he gonna die there? But no, he dies later when the generic bad guy you don't care about just tries to kill Archer, and Tucker kills himself in order to stop them to do it. And a lot of people pointed out there's probably a better way for him to stop them that didn't involve killing himself. So it seemed like a very unnecessary death. And on top of that, afterwards, like at the conference, the peace conference or whatever, that's supposed to be a formation of the Federation, like all the other people, Hoshi and Mayweather and Reed, are all sitting there like they don't give a shit that their best friend just died. And so it is very mishandling of his death. So I can see all that definitely makes for a poor finale, I will say. But on the other hand, the reason why I would say this episode is not that bad is because I can kind of see, even though I see people's perspective on why having Troy and Riker narrate the episode it's not the right thing for a finale. I can see what they're going for, because they're going for a way to put Enterprise in its proper context in the greater Star Trek universe. And I actually think it's actually quite powerful to show that Archer is still seen and revered as a strong figure even in Next Generation times, and how what he did was the foundation of what created this Federation. So I think it was an interesting contrast to show the Starfleet in that Federation in this future, and this is all thanks to Archer. And it's interesting seeing people we're familiar with in the future, such as Riker and Troy, like recognizing them and experiencing this and seeing this part of their history. And I also love the ending that showed all the different, here these are the Voyagers, the monologuing things between Kirk, Picard, and Archer, and sort of that. Again, that was a nice way to tie. So in a way, I thought that was a good way to end the series, to tie it all together. So I think there's nothing wrong with the concept, and also, like, I like the concept of Riker and Troy narrating an Enterprise episode. Just maybe it shouldn't have been the finale. Maybe it should have just been a different episode. But this is similar to other like Voyager episodes or other episodes of shows where they have other figures, like the Voyager episode with the dinosaur aliens or whatever they were called, where we saw the whole thing from their perspective and they were narrating, and we've seen other episodes where they had other aliens narrate events that actually happened in Voyager, like Living Witness is another example of that. So I think there's nothing wrong with that idea, and having Riker and Troy be the narrators is actually a very fascinating idea. It's just maybe it shouldn't have been the finale, and they should have had something that was stayed more true, to focus more on the Enterprise characters for the finale. So I get that, but that doesn't make it a terrible finale. It just says that maybe it wasn't the right choice. And also, like, I don't like Trip, so I didn't mind his death. Maybe that's just me. And when I first saw it, I actually cheered that he died, but watching season 4 in context, they actually elevated the character and did more with him, so I wouldn't say I was happy he died. But I wasn't heartbroken either. I was struck with how little impact it seemed to have on everyone else. But then again, we got that nice scene with T'Pol and Archer, where T'Pol was really upset over it. But I do think that they did handle it kind of haphazardly, and they could have done a better job. But it was also cool seeing like Shran in the future and the kind of relationship that he has with Archer, and playing off of that friendship as a good callback to the finale. I just think maybe they could have done more with it than what they actually did. So what I'm saying here is there's a lot of good ideas, and some of them somewhat work, but for the most part, the episode needed to be tweaked. It needed to be longer. It needed maybe not to be the finale, and it could have worked. So it's not a terrible episode, because there's a lot of good ideas you have within this episode, and I think that people are absolutely wrong when they say this is one of the worst. I don't think this is anywhere near one of the worst episodes of Enterprise. I think there's like tons and tons of episodes in season 1 and 2 that are much worse, and I'll give you a spoiler, because I'm going to do in a month, I'm going to do my top 15 worst episodes of Enterprise, and I'll give you a spoiler. This episode does not make that list. It's not even my top 15 worst episodes. In fact, there are no season 3 or 4 episodes that make that list. That list isn't comprised entirely of season 1 and 2 episodes, because I think there's plenty of bad episodes that are way worse. Brennan Berga should be apologizing for those episodes. He should be apologizing for the theme song before he apologizes for this one, which actually is not that terrible. It was a good idea that maybe wasn't fully developed and could have used a bit more development, but it's not that, it really is not that bad. I really feel strongly about this. Anyway, so that's it for all the episodes of season 4 of Enterprise. So now I gotta name the best and worst episodes of the season. Similar to season 3, there weren't very many contenders for worst episode of this season. There were only 2, and so the runner-up was Bound, that horrible Orion slave girl one, but the worst episode of season 4 is Daedalus, which is mainly, it was really boring. It wasn't well developed. It was cliche. Oh, there's an alien thing coming around killing people. Ooh, it turns out just to be this guy's son that he's trying to save. It was really underdeveloped, and I really don't see the point of this episode. It was really boring. It felt like almost like a season 1 callback, really. So, next to get into the best episodes of Enterprise, and just like season 3, there's a lot of contenders. For this one, you got Cold Station 12, you got Home, you got The Forge, Babel 1, United, In the Mirror Darkly, Awakenings, The Observer Effect, but the best episode of season 4 is Kirshara. Absolutely, I mean, you could lump the whole 3-parter together if you like, but if I had to choose one, I would choose Kirshara, because this is the one that everything came to a head, and it was very powerful, where, the fantasy feel to it, with Archer has this magical artifact he has to get to calls peace in Vulcan, and they do it in such a way that really sells it. At the same time, they have this very strong, powerful, poignant commentary on the Iraq War with the corrupt president trying to cause a war, lying, saying there's weapons of mass destruction when he knows it's not, in order for his own political gain. Absolutely love it. I think this is a staple of Star Trek, one of the best episodes of the franchise. So, my rating for Season 4 of Enterprise as a whole, I'm going to give this, out of 10, I'm going to give this an 8. Extremely good. There was a lot of powerful moments, like the Vulcan 3-parter was amazing. Seeing the way they wrapped up the Xindi story arc with Home was really great. You got standalone episodes like The Observer Effect, and In the Mirror Darkly, where we fanboy out hard. But other than In the Mirror Darkly, I do think that the second half of Season 4 did lose a bit of steam. We got some mediocre episodes like Affliction, Divergence, where, this is why the Klingons' heads were flat, which pissed me off. And then you got some boring episodes like Demons and Terra Prime, which didn't quite work, or Bound, which is quite horrible, and These Are the Voyages, which, again, not the worst episode in the world, but still not a really good way to end the show. So it did kind of dip, so for that reason I had to drop it from a 9 to an 8. And I personally think Season 3 is the better season, but still this is definitely a strong season, a very good season of Star Trek in the entire franchise. It does, after watching Season 3 and 4 back-to-back, does make me rethink how I like to bash Enterprise, because I'm just focusing too much on the first 2 seasons. And really, you got to take these 2 seasons into account. This is really good. So I will say maybe I do like this show, Enterprise, just as much as Voyager. I don't know. Maybe I am not giving this show enough credit. So anyway, that is it for my review of Season 4 of Enterprise. So that finishes my coverage of Enterprise, or at least the seasons. I do have next month, I will be doing my top 15 worst episodes of Enterprise and my top 30 best episodes of Enterprise. I always also try to do a third countdown that's unique to the series. I always do something different for each show. For Enterprise, I'm doing the top 10 worst cases of sheer incompetence. And of course, I'm going to focus mostly on the first 2 seasons. And this is me looking negatively on the show. But the parts where I thought the characters were completely incompetent to the point of it not being believable. So I'll be doing that as well. But after that, my coverage of Enterprise will be over. And so it's tradition, when I finish off a season, the last season of a show, I'm reviewing it to announce which show I will be covering next in 2 months, because next month I'll be doing these top 10 of Enterprise. But the month after, I will engage to cover Star Trek The Next Generation. Finally, I've been putting this one off because my brother already did the same format over in his channel, but finally I'm going to give you my take, my version of Engage. Make it so. Star Trek The Next Generation, I'll start covering that in the new year, I think, January 2019. Anyway, thank you guys, or 2020, God, I'm a year behind. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this. Be sure to check out my channel for much more Star Trek coverage, as well as I cover many other shows like Mr. Robot, Lost, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.